Today we're going to explore one of the most fascinating and least celebrated aspects of medieval life. How the great castles managed the garbage and sewage of hundreds, and sometimes over 1,000, people living under the same stone roof. Before we continue with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine for a moment a medieval fortress at the peak of its occupation. Not the silent castle of tourist photographs, empty and majestic against the grey sky of Europe. Imagine it alive, noisy, full of animals, children, soldiers, cooks, blacksmiths, laundresses, horses, dogs and pigs. Imagine the smell of bread baking, wet straw, tanned leather, and the smoke from 10 fireplaces burning at the same time. Now imagine all these people generating every day tons of waste, not as a metaphor, as a fact. This is the real castle, and it is precisely here that one of the most surprising stories of human engineering begins, the story of how medieval civilizations faced a problem that at first glance seems impossible, maintaining the hygiene and daily functioning of an entire city concentrated within stone walls. For centuries, the popular image of the medieval castle has been caught between two equally distorted extremes. On one side, the romantic fantasy of chivalric romances, gleaming halls, sumptuous banquets, and impeccable ladies in embroidered dresses. On the other, the dark caricature of the Middle Ages as a period of universal filth and ignorance. The truth, as almost always happens, lies somewhere between these two extremes, and it is much more interesting than either of them. To understand how the castle dealt with its waste, one must first understand what it actually was. A castle was not merely a luxury residence for a powerful noble, it was a complete institution, administrative seat of a territory, military headquarters, center of economic production and permanent shelter, for a huge variety of people with distinct functions. In a medium-sized castle in England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire from the 12th to the 14th century, the number of permanent inhabitants could range from 200 to 500. But during periods of conflict, celebrations, or large political assemblies, that number could double or triple, reaching 1,000 or more. There were the knights and their squires, the chamber servants responsible for the lord's apartments, the cooks, bakers, butchers, falconers, grooms, carpenters, and blacksmiths, the garrison soldiers, the wall guards, and the messengers who came and went continuously. And there were, of course, the animals. Horses in sufficient numbers for military and transport needs, pigs raised in the inner courtyards, feeding on leftover food, chickens, pigeons, and ducks kept for the lord's table, hunting dogs in the stables, and also the oxen, often brought inside the walls during siege periods, when the gates were closed for weeks or months on end. Each of these beings, human or animal, generated waste. Every meal left leftovers, peels, and fats. Every productive process, whether the forge, the carpentry, or the dyeing, generated its own debris. And all of it had to go somewhere. What makes this problem particularly fascinating is that medieval builders did not ignore it. The archaeological evidence and documentary records that have come down to us show that waste management was a concrete concern in castle planning. It was not a secondary detail, it was a matter of survival, both sanitary and strategic, especially during a prolonged siege. And it is here that the narrative reveals its most surprising layer. The medieval people did not leave the problem unanswered. They developed systems that, although very different from ours, were ingeniously adapted to the realities of their time, their environment, and the materials available. In some respects, these systems demonstrate a remarkably sophisticated understanding of the relationship between the built environment and collective health. These systems had names, specific functions, and were maintained by dedicated workers, many of whom held formally recognized positions in the castle hierarchy. And it is about them, about their logic, their architecture, and their solutions, that this documentary will focus. But to get there, one must contemplate the problem in its full scale. An adult human produces on average between 150 and 200 grams of solid waste per day. In a community of 1,000 people, this represents per week a significant amount of organic material that needs to be removed or processed. Add to that the waste from animals, whose individual volumes are considerably larger, and the scale of the challenge becomes truly tangible. And this was only one type of waste. There were the wastewater from the kitchens laden with fats and scraps. There were the materials from the workshops, metal slag, wood chips, leather scraps and ashes. There were the carcasses of animals that died within the walls. And there was the common household garbage, shards of pottery, deteriorated clothing, broken tools, and everything else that the daily life of a large community inevitably produces. How did the medieval people organize their thinking around this reality? What architectural and practical solutions did they find? And what were the limits and contradictions of these solutions? The answers begin in the very stones of the castle, in the deliberate choices of the builders, made centuries before any modern plumbing existed. And it is precisely among these stones, hidden in the details that tourists almost never notice, that the most real history of the medieval castle awaits to be told. There is a detail in the original construction plans of the great medieval castles that modern architects and archaeologists have learned to identify almost immediately: the presence of small chambers inserted into the thickness of the walls, with a narrow access facing the inner rooms and a discreet opening facing the exterior. These are modest structures, often ignored by visitors in favor of the imposing towers and throne rooms. But for those who study medieval daily life, they represent something fundamental: the first architectural response to the problem posed in the previous chapter. These chambers received different names over the centuries. In English, they became known as garderobes. In French, as latrines or retraits. In medieval Latin, as necessaria, the plural of necessarium, the necessary, that which simply cannot fail to exist. The name in itself says a lot about how the medieval people viewed the problem, not as a taboo to be hidden, but as a functional necessity to be solved competently. The medieval garderobe, in its most basic form, was a compartment built in overhang on the outer wall of the castle, with a wooden or stone seat positioned over an opening that projected beyond the limits of the structure. The waste simply fell through the opening, descending along the outer face of the wall until it accumulated in a pit dug at the foot of the wall, or, in castles built over rivers, streams, or water moats, directly into the current below. At first glance, it may seem like a rudimentary solution, but there is considerable intelligence behind it. By projecting the structure beyond the wall, the builders ensured that waste did not remain within the living space. By positioning it over a pit or watercourse, they reduced accumulation inside the perimeter. And by building it from stone, especially in the nobles' chambers, they made the space more durable, easier to maintain, and, to a certain extent, more private than the available alternatives. But the garderobe was just one element of a much more complex system. To understand the whole, one must grasp how these compartments were distributed throughout the castle and who had access to them. The answer reveals something fundamental. The distribution of latrines was an almost perfect mirror of the medieval social hierarchy. The most elaborate garderobes, equipped with carved stone seats, ventilation ducts in the walls, and in some cases, antechambers that ensured privacy, were reserved for the upper floors of towers and residential buildings, the spaces of the lord, the lady, the highest-ranking knights and illustrious guests. As one descended the social hierarchy, the facilities became simpler and more collective. The garrison soldiers, craftsmen, and lower-ranking servants had access to more basic structures, positioned on the lower floors or in the outer courtyards. In some cases, they shared collective wooden latrines built over open pits or over the outer moats. Privacy was minimal, the structure was temporary, and cleanliness depended far more on collective routine than on any sophisticated architectural device. This division was not merely a matter of comfort or status. It was also a practical matter. The waste produced on the upper floors had a longer path to the pit, which reduced the risk of accumulation near living spaces. The nobles' chambers were also farther from sources of soil contamination, reducing, even if intuitively in an era when germ theory was still completely unknown, the risk of contact with harmful agents. Not all builders, however, limited themselves to the basic suspended garderobe model. In the most ambitious castles, especially those built or renovated between the 13th and 14th centuries, more sophisticated solutions emerge. In some English and French fortresses, Archaeologists have identified systems of ducts embedded in the stone walls, vertical channels that connected latrines on different floors to a single collection chamber at the base of the wall, emptied periodically by specialized workers, whom we will discuss in detail later. There are also records of castles that made ingenious use of natural watercourses. When the topography allowed, medieval builders diverted streams or channeled rainwater to pass beneath the latrine blocks, creating a continuous drainage system that did away with the need for periodic manual emptying. It was an elegant solution, combining the resources of the natural environment with the needs of the community, and which, in some respects, anticipated the basic principles of modern sanitation centuries in advance. Dover Castle in England provides one of the most studied examples of this planning. Built in its current form largely under the reign of Henry II in the 12th century, the castle incorporates a system of stone ducts that carried waste from the upper latrines outside the walls, taking advantage of the natural slope of the land. Researchers who have studied its architecture have identified more than 20 latrine chambers distributed throughout the complex, which gives a clear measure of how seriously this issue was taken by the builders of the time. But as the centuries advanced and castles were expanded to accommodate ever-growing populations, it became clear that architecture, no matter how clever, could not solve the problem on its own. An additional layer of organization was needed, a human and administrative structure that could handle what the stones could not do by themselves. And it is this layer that begins to reveal itself when one looks beyond the walls and asks, who after all kept everything running? The question that closed the previous chapter has an answer that history has recorded with surprising wealth of detail, and that answer begins with a name. A name that, by medieval standards, carried both practical weight and social stigma: the gong farmer. The term of medieval English origin derives from the Anglo-Saxon word gang, which meant, depending on the context, to go or a place to go to. Over time, it came to designate both the latrine itself and the workers responsible for emptying the pits where waste accumulated. In France, these professionals were known as vidangeurs. In other regions of Europe, different local names applied, but the function was universally the same. They were the men whose task was to remove, transport, and dispose of the waste accumulated in the pits of castles, convents, and towns that relied on fixed collection structures for their basic sanitation. It was a job that most people avoided at all costs, and precisely for that reason, those who performed it had a bargaining power that surprises modern researchers. Financial records from English castles of the 13th and 14th centuries, documents meticulously kept by royal accountants, many of which have reached us intact, show that gong farmers were well-paid workers by the standards of their time. In some documented instances, their fees amounted to several multiples of a common rural laborer's wages, reflecting not only the difficulty of the task, but also its absolute indispensability for the functioning of any organized community. They worked predominantly at night. This was not merely a social convention. In many cases, it was a formal requirement established by castle administrations and in towns by municipal regulations. Night work served two very concrete, practical purposes. First, it kept the workers out of sight of the inhabitants during the busiest hours of the courtyards and corridors. Second, the cooler night air, especially during European winters, made the task slightly more bearable and reduced the speed at which odors spread through the castle's chambers. Thus arose the term recorded in some historical sources, nightmen. The pit of a medium-sized medieval latrine could take years to fill completely, depending on the number of users and the original depth of the excavation. When the level became concerning, it was time to hire the gong farmers. The operation could take anywhere from a single night to several weeks, depending on the accumulated volume. In the end, the chamber was cleaned and often treated with lime to reduce odors and accelerate the natural decomposition of the remaining waste. The material removed, however, was not simply discarded anywhere. This is one of the most revealing discoveries of historical studies on the subject. The waste from medieval cesspits had real and recognized economic value. Rich in nitrogen and organic compounds, it was highly effective as agricultural fertilizer. The gong farmers often traded this material with farmers from the surrounding areas who incorporated it into the soil of their fields. Records from various regions show organized markets where this material was commercialized, with prices varying according to quality and seasonal demand. What modern language would call a circular economy was, for the medieval people, simply common sense. But the gong farmers were not the only ones responsible for the castle's hygiene. They operated, so to speak, at the deepest and most critical end of the system. Before reaching them, the everyday waste was managed by a chain of other workers, each with their specific function within the castle's hierarchy. The so-called rakers, whose job was literally to sweep and scrape the courtyards, corridors, and common areas, were figures present in practically every medium to large-sized castle. They collected the day-to-day debris, food scraps, old straw from animal bedding, ashes from hearths, wood shavings from artisans, and all the small refuse that the intense life of a large community inevitably generated. The collected material was taken to designated disposal sites, waste pits, whose locations modern archaeologists often identify during excavations of medieval sites, and which function as veritable time capsules of daily life. There were also the kitchen workers, who managed a continuous flow of organic waste. The kitchens of large castles operated without interruption during periods of heavy occupation, and their byproducts had to be disposed of in an organized manner. A significant portion went to feed the pigs raised in the inner courtyards. Another part was destined for composting areas nearby. The medieval economy, marked by resource scarcity, developed a far more pragmatic relationship with waste than our own. Nothing was wasted without first investigating whether there was some possible use for it. What emerges from this picture is the image of a surprisingly organized human system, not the chaos of filth and negligence that popular imagination often assumes, but a functional hierarchy of specialized workers, each operating at a distinct level of the castle's waste cycle. A system that, in order to exist, had to be planned, funded, and managed continuously over years and decades. And it is precisely this management who made the decisions, how resources were allocated, and what the consequences were when the system failed, that the next chapter will address. Because, as will be seen, failures did exist, and when they happened, their consequences could be far more serious than a simple inconvenience. To understand what happened when a castle's sanitation system failed, one must first understand how medieval people explained the relationship between environment and disease. They did not know about germs, they had no microscopes, and they had no concept of what a microorganism might be, but they had eyes, and they had enough collective memory to perceive that certain environmental conditions consistently preceded people falling ill. The theory that would emerge from these observations, and that would dominate European medical thought for over 1,000 years, became known as the miasmatic theory. According to it, disease was caused by corrupted air, the miasma, from the ancient Greek for stain or pollution. This corrupted air emanated from places where organic matter decayed: swamps, open pits, piles of accumulated garbage, unremoved animal carcasses. The solution, therefore, was to remove the sources of odor, clean, ventilate, move waste away from inhabited spaces. The theory was wrong about the mechanisms, but it was surprisingly correct in its practical conclusions. The same places that produced the odors the medieval people feared were, in fact, the very sources where transmissible diseases thrived. The instinct to clean and remove waste, motivated by fear of miasma, produced in practice sanitary results very close to those that would be recommended centuries later, when germ theory finally replaced the miasmatic theory. This meant that for a medieval administrator, the visible and olfactory deterioration of the castle environment was more than a discomfort. It was an alarm signal. And when the signal sounded, the response could be both practical and desperate. The historical documents that have come down to us record numerous episodes where the sanitary conditions of castles and noble residences provoked direct interventions by their lords or the monarchs connected to them. One of the most frequently cited cases by historians is that of King Philip II of France, known as Philip Augustus, who at the end of the 12th century was said to have been so persistently disturbed by the odors reaching his windows at the royal palace of Paris that he ordered an extensive program of paving the city's streets. The intention, at least in part, was to cover the most obvious sources of putrefaction that accumulated on the ground. Similar episodes recur in records throughout Europe. In English castles, royal orders for cleaning, the so-called writs of cleansing, were documents issued when conditions in certain royal residences reached a point considered unacceptable. Winchester Castle appears in 13th century records as the target of cleaning orders issued by the monarch himself, describing the state of certain areas as unsuitable for the presence of the court. These documents are precious, not because they reveal the exception, but because they reveal the pattern. There was a threshold of tolerance, and, when it was exceeded, the response was institutional and documented. But if the everyday failures of the system were already problematic, there was one situation that amplified them drastically and relentlessly: the siege. A medieval siege was, among many other things, a sanitary crisis of great proportions. When a castle's gates closed before an enemy army, everything that existed within the walls, people, animals, food, and waste, was confined indefinitely. The disposal systems that depended on communication with the outside were cut off. The gong farmers could not enter. Garbage accumulated with no route of exit. In sieges that stretched for weeks or months, historical records consistently point to the emergence of disease within the walls as one of the main factors that determined the outcome of the confrontation. It was not uncommon for the defending garrison, even if well supplied with food and water, to succumb to the collective weakening caused by disease long before any breach in the walls was opened. In many documented cases, the siege was not won by the attacker. It was lost by the defender, from the inside out. Medieval military commanders who understood this dynamic would try to prepare their castles before the siege began. This included not only stockpiling provisions, but also deepening the pits of the latrines, creating additional disposal spaces within the walls, and, when time allowed, organizing the distribution of people and animals so that waste was kept as far away as possible from the areas where people slept and food was prepared. It was a logic that, in modern language, approaches sanitary risk management in emergency situations. The medieval people would not have used that vocabulary, but the intuition was the same: anticipate the problem before it becomes impossible to control. Outside the context of sieges, the most common failures came from elsewhere. They came from growth. Medieval castles were structures that expanded continuously over generations. New towers, new buildings, new outbuildings were added as the lord's power and wealth grew. But the sanitation systems did not always keep pace with that growth at the same rate. A pit designed for 100 people could, decades later, be receiving the waste of 300. A garderobe built to serve 2 chambers could end up shared by 6. When the capacity of the systems was exceeded by population growth, the consequences became progressively more visible. And it is at this point in history that one of the most curious and least known figures of the entire medieval world emerges, the person charged not only with solving crises when they arrived, but with preventing them from arriving in the first place: the castle administrator, or seneschal, and his direct, daily relationship with the problem that this documentary has been exploring from the beginning. The seneschal was, in modern terms, something close to a director of operations. It fell to him to supervise the daily functioning of the castle in all its practical dimensions: food stocks, maintenance of structures, administration of servants, the lord's accounts, and, inevitably, the management of the systems that kept that community running in a minimally orderly fashion. It was a position of absolute trust, almost always held by a man of long experience and proven loyalty to the lord of the castle. Among the many documents that seneschals produced in their administrative routine, and that modern historians study with enormous interest, are the so-called books of office or expense records. In these volumes, written in Latin or in the local vernacular languages, there appear entries that reveal with unexpected precision how much waste management was a concrete item in the castle's budget. There are payments to gong farmers. There are purchases of lime for treating the pits. There are records of repairs to stone ducts of the latrines. There are even notes on the proceeds from the sale of waste to farmers, revenue that in some cases partially offset the costs of cleaning. But the seneschal did not operate solely on the basis of improvisation or individual experience. In many castles, especially those of the great royal and noble houses, he followed formal documents that historians today call household ordinances, written regulations that governed in detail the internal functioning of the residence. These ordinances covered everything from the hierarchy of servants and the rules of table service to very specific provisions on where and how waste should be disposed of. The domestic ordinances of the English royal household of the 13th and 14th centuries offer some of the most detailed examples that have come down to us. They specified, for example, that no waste should be discarded in areas near the castle's drinking water sources. They determined that animals should not be kept in certain wings of the complex for prolonged periods. They established daily cleaning routines for the courtyards and kitchens, with responsibilities clearly assigned to specific categories of servants. This last determination, the one prohibiting the disposal of waste near water sources, points to one of the most critical and most complex issues in all of the sanitary management of a medieval castle: the relationship between waste disposal systems and water supply systems. Water was the most vital resource within any fortress. A castle could withstand a prolonged siege without many things. Without water, it could withstand nothing. And the main source of water for a castle was, in most cases, one or more wells dug within the perimeter of the walls, wells that could reach considerable depths to access the water table below. The problem is that these wells were vulnerable. Groundwater does not flow in a straight line. It travels through the terrain following gradients and fractures in the rock, carrying with it whatever it encounters along the way. If a latrine pit or a pile of organic waste was positioned upstream of the water table that supplied the castle's well, even at a distance that seemed safe visually, contamination of the water source was a very real possibility, albeit completely invisible to those without tools to detect it. Medieval builders did not understand the hydrogeological mechanisms behind this risk, but they understood its effects. Historical records document castles whose inhabitants fell ill recurrently and inexplicably, whose water had an altered taste or odor, and where the proximity to waste pits was, in retrospect, the most likely cause. It was not theoretical knowledge. It was empirical learning, accumulated over generations and transmitted as a practical rule: keep water sources as far as possible from waste sources. In more carefully planned castles, this separation was deliberate and architecturally incorporated. The wells were located on the opposite side of the courtyard from the latrine blocks. The kitchens, which needed water continuously, were positioned to minimize the risk of cross-contamination. In some castles built on hills or promontories, the topography was used in favor of this planning. The latrines were installed at the lowest points of the complex so that any natural drainage would flow away from water sources and not toward them. Bodiam Castle in England, built at the end of the 14th century, is often cited as an example of relatively sophisticated sanitary planning for its time. Its system of latrines, distributed over multiple floors and connected to a strategically positioned collection chamber, was designed taking into account both drainage and distance from supply sources. Archaeologists who studied its layout identified evidence that the separation between waste disposal systems and water wells was not accidental. It was a design choice. What these examples reveal when brought together is a conclusion that modern historians took some time to formulate clearly. Medieval builders and administrators were not ignorant about sanitation. They were ignorant about the underlying microbiology, yes, but they had developed through observation and accumulated experience a set of practices that proved functionally effective in many contexts. And this practical competence was not limited to castles. Parallel to the secular world of lordships and fortresses, there existed another architectural and administrative universe that dealt with the same challenges, and that, in several respects, had arrived at even more elaborate solutions. It was the world of the monasteries, and it is to this realm that the narrative now turns. If castles represent the secular face of the European solution to sanitation, monasteries represent its contemplative face, and, in many respects, a technically superior one. While castles evolved their systems reactively, responding to growth and crises as they arose, monasteries developed approaches that were, from the outset, planned, systematic, and integrated into the very philosophy of life that defined them. The reason for this begins with a rule written in the 6th century by an Italian monk named Benedict of Nursia. The rule of Saint Benedict, which would become the founding document for hundreds of Benedictine monasteries across medieval Europe, was not concerned solely with prayer, work, and obedience. It also dealt with hygiene, with a specificity that would astonish any modern reader expecting only spiritual texts. The rule established that the brothers were to keep their bodies and their surroundings clean as an integral part of monastic discipline. Cleanliness, in the Benedictine tradition, was not a matter of comfort. It was a matter of moral and spiritual order. This philosophical orientation had very concrete architectural consequences. In Benedictine monasteries and later in Cistercian ones, which in the 12th century would take austerity and functional planning to their most refined extremes, the main sanitary facility received a very specific name and location. It was called the reredorta, from medieval Latin for that which is behind the dormitory. It was a building in its own right, typically constructed in continuity with the monks' dormitory, deliberately positioned over a watercourse or over a channel specially built to pass beneath its foundations. This detail, water running permanently beneath the latrines, is what distinguishes the reredorta from virtually any equivalent solution in the secular castles of its time. While castle garderobes discharged into static pits that had to be emptied periodically by gong farmers, the monastic reredorta featured a continuous drainage system. The water flowed, carried everything away, and the problem disappeared downstream, automatically and without interruption. Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, England, offers one of the most well-preserved and most studied examples of this system. Founded in 1132 by a group of Cistercian monks, the abbey was built with remarkable topographical intelligence along the banks of the River Skell. The abbey's reredorta, whose ruins are still visited today, was positioned directly over the river, whose waters ran through a carefully constructed channel beneath the row of stone seats. The result was a disposal system that, by the simplicity of its engineering and the elegance of its integration with the natural environment, surpassed in efficiency most of the solutions found in contemporary castles. But Fountains was not an isolated case. The Cistercians, in particular, developed a veritable culture of water management that manifested itself in all the order's monasteries. When choosing sites for the construction of new monasteries, the brothers systematically evaluated the topography, the available watercourses, and the possibilities for diversion and channeling. They dug ditches, built weirs, redirected streams. Water was directed where it was needed, to the kitchens, the gardens, the mills, the laundries, and waste was directed away from all of that, always following the natural gradient of the land. The water supply plan of Canterbury Cathedral Priory, dated to around 1153, is perhaps the most extraordinary technical document of the medieval period to have survived to our day. It is a drawing on parchment showing the entire water distribution system of the community, where the water came from, how it was distributed among the buildings, and how drainage channels carried waste away from areas of use. Scholars have been impressed not because it reveals unknown technologies, but because it demonstrates a degree of systemic planning truly exceptional for its time. Monasteries also mostly had a specific space called the lavatorium, a fountain or set of taps positioned at the entrance to the refectory where the monks washed their hands before meals. The practice was prescribed by the rule, integrated into the daily routine, and carried out with the regularity of a ritual. In an age when most people washed their hands only when the opportunity arose, the lavatorium represented a hygiene standard that, motivated by spiritual reasons, produced very concrete sanitary effects. This relative superiority of monasteries in matters of sanitation did not go unnoticed by the secular world. There is evidence that some castle lords who maintained close ties with neighboring monastic communities incorporated elements of monastic planning into their own structures, especially regarding the use of watercourses for drainage. The transfer of knowledge between the monastic world and the secular world is one of the most fascinating themes in the history of medieval technology, and the field of sanitation is one of its least explored chapters. What emerges from this comparison between castles and monasteries is a richer and more nuanced picture than either institution alone could offer. Together, they reveal that the medieval world was not monolithic in its approach to the practical challenges of collective life. There were significant differences in intention, in resources, and in outcomes, and these differences had real consequences for the people who lived in these environments. And it is precisely by returning to these people, not to the stones, not to the documents, not to the systems, but to the human beings who inhabited, worked, and died within those walls, that the narrative of this documentary finds its final chapter. Throughout this documentary, we have traveled a path that began with the stones of the walls and the records of medieval accountants, passed through the architectural systems of castles and the regulations of monasteries, and arrived at the hands of the gong farmers who worked in the European dawn. But there is a dimension that all these systems and structures by themselves cannot fully reveal: the dimension of lived experience. What was it, in fact, for the ordinary human beings who lived in these castles to face daily the sanitary challenges that this documentary has described? Archaeology offers some clues. Excavations of medieval sites reveal, with increasing frequency, evidence that contradicts the image of total surrender to filth that common sense associates with the Middle Ages. Bone and wooden combs found in English and French excavations indicate that hair care was a daily practice among broad segments of the population. Fragments of herbs known for their aromatic and repellent properties, such as rue, mint, and lavender, are found in medieval occupation layers of castles across Europe, suggesting their deliberate use in domestic environments. Written records describe regular baths, especially among the upper strata of society, and the presence of tubs and water heaters in inventories of 13th and 14th century castles is more frequent than popular imagination usually assumes. That does not mean life in a medieval castle was comfortable by modern standards. Far from it. The cold of the winter months, the constant smoke from fireplaces without proper chimneys, the lack of sufficient lighting, and yes, the inevitable odors of a dense community living in limited space, all of this made up a daily reality, very far from the sterility to which the inhabitants of industrialized cities are accustomed. But the central point this documentary has sought to establish from the start is something else. It is not about romanticizing the Middle Ages, nor about equating it with the present. It is about understanding it on its own terms. And when one does that, what emerges is the image of a civilization that faced a genuinely difficult problem: the sanitation of large communities in enclosed environments, without industrial technology, without microbiology, and without modern urban infrastructure, and found for it functional, intelligent, and in many cases, surprisingly enduring solutions. The legacy of these solutions did not disappear with the Middle Ages. Many of the intuitions that medieval builders developed empirically, the separation between water sources and waste sources, the use of flowing water for continuous drainage, the importance of ventilation in sanitary spaces, the allocation of organic waste for agricultural use, would later be confirmed, refined, and systematized by modern science. The path between the stone garderobe of a 12th century castle and the sanitation system of a contemporary city is long and full of technological revolutions. But it is a continuous path. Each generation built upon what the previous one had attempted. There is also something deeply human in this story that deserves recognition. The gong farmers who worked in the early hours, the stewards who meticulously recorded every expense of lime and cleaning, the monks who dug channels to divert streams beneath their Riri daughters, the builders who positioned latrines against the prevailing wind to protect the Lord's chambers. All of them were people solving problems, not with the resources we have today, not with the knowledge we have accumulated over the following centuries, but with everything they had at their disposal: ingenuity, observation, tradition, and the relentless necessity that collective life imposes on any civilization that wishes to remain functional. It is a lesson that transcends the Middle Ages by far. The societies that thrive are, in large part, those that manage to organize collective life in a way that makes the everyday sustainable, not only for the elites in the upper floors of the towers, but for the whole of the people who make that community exist and function. The medieval castles that worked best were those whose administrators understood this, even if in terms completely different from our own. And when today we pass by the ruins of a medieval fortress, the towers pointing to the sky, the dry moats, the moss-covered walls, we can choose to see them only as a backdrop for battles and noble intrigues. Or we can look a little deeper and also see what is not on the surface: the stone ducts inside the walls, the pits dug into the foundations, the channels that once brought clean water and carried waste away, the invisible systems that allowed all that human life, with everything about it that is grand and everyday, epic and prosaic, to actually happen. This is the lesser-told story of medieval castles, and it is perhaps one of the most truly human. If this documentary has sparked your curiosity about this hidden face of history, leave in the comments which aspect surprised you the most. Every perspective that arrives enriches this conversation that spans the centuries. Like the video if the journey was worth it. This simple gesture helps this channel continue to bring stories that official history often forgets to tell. And if you want to be notified when the next documentary narrative goes live, subscribe now. See you in the next chapter.